This is Andrew, and he's gone from growing up in a pretty poor neighbourhood to owning 43 properties. And over the last 2 decades, he's helped thousands of Kiwis grow and build property portfolios too. But as you'll see in this episode, if he had to do it all over again, he'd do things a little differently. Things that slowed him down and nearly cost him everything more than once. So in this video, you're going to learn the 3 stages of how Andrew built his portfolio, the mistakes he made along the way, including those that he still sees other investors making today. I'm Ed, an economist and property investor, and this is the Property Academy podcast.
And the interesting thing about you, mate, is that a lot of people look at you and think, this rich prick. But it's true. Like,
apparently so.
But what do you think most people get wrong about property investors and especially your journey?
Well, I think to begin with, they think that you've got to be really rich to get into property investment, which is completely not the case. Like, there was no handout for me. There was no handout for anyone in my family. And we basically came from a lower socioeconomic area of Christchurch, where money was really tight. So both parents worked, in fact, multiple jobs. I think Dad would bike to work on freezing cold Christchurch mornings. We'd have, you always like the Tegel offcuts story. So I remember we would get these giant sacks, I think like 20 kg or 10 kg bags of Tegel offcuts, the chicken.
What makes it an offcut? Is it like the chicken knee or something?
It's just a bit like it's just they're a bit like kind of lumpy, and they weren't supermarket perfect, I guess.
Yeah, so you ate deformed chicken.
Yeah, fine. and it was actually quite good. You just chuck it in a casserole or something like that, and Bob's your uncle. Follow me for more cooking tips. And
I know that in a lot of Kiwi families, the day you get paid at the start of the month, your family feels like you're absolutely rich, so you're out for fish and chips, and then by the end of the month, the money's run out, and so you're back on the Tegel offcuts.
Yeah, that was the rough time because, of course, Dad got paid monthly because it was an international brand that he worked for, and because of that, and because of the fact that they were so useless with money or managing the cash flow, there was just no money by the end of the month. Like you'd know we have to wait till next week to ask for anything because there's no money.
Yeah, and so I think that idea that property investors are born wealthy is kind of not correct. Like you've got to, or for many Kiwis, you start investing in property and that's how you get wealthy. But the other thing that's quite interesting in your journey is you started out with a very low deposit, but it took you some time to build it, and you had some really interesting jobs when you were young.
Oh, I had so many jobs. So I'd either be trying to sell something or peddle off something to someone. I worked for Terry Delaw's Carpet Kingdom, gathering up the smoothies. Do you remember that one?
No, tell us about that.
So Terry Delaw's Carpet Kingdom was on Wilson's Road, across the road from our house, and I went and I used to vacuum their floors, their showroom floors for them every day after school. I used to prepare the underlay for the jobs for the next day, so I'd cut it to size. And the worst job was the smooth edge. So smooth edge goes along the edge of your thing, and it's these little planks of wood, and they've got little spiky tacks in it. So I'd take my little girly arms and I'd get 34 of the smooth edge as per the order, and I'd try and bundle them up with rope, and I'd have scratches all up my arms.
He's still got them today with his delicate skin. Tell us about when you were a magician, because I remember once we were out for dinner and I think somebody came up and was like, you used to do magic at my restaurant.
Yeah, oh, that's right. That was Pat from south of the border. So when I was about maybe 14, 15, I used to do kids magic shows for kids' parties and balloon animals. I learned to do balloon animals. And then I thought, actually, I could make some money out of this. So I used to go around to restaurants, and I remember my first ever one was Blue Jean Cuisine, a really nice man called Murray Trail that owns lots of McDonald's now. He gave me my first job, and I worked Thursday, Friday, and Saturday night for an hour session each night, and he paid me something like $40, and then, which was a lot of money back then. Buy a house with that back then, and then I'd also get tips. So I'd make sure that I'd go and spend a lot of time with that guy that was on a first date, because you want to get a first date there because he wants to show off to his girlfriend, and so he's going to give you a $20 tip. because he wants to be the big man. So you make sure you focus on them. You don't go for someone like you who just looks like an accountant that's never going to give you a tip.
Well, I'm not a charity, Andrew.
No. So I made a lot of money. I made a lot of money doing that, my magic at restaurants, but all sorts of jobs. I would do anything to make a buck.
And I suppose the reason we're talking about this is you just had an opinion piece on Stuff where you shared the story of how you went from owning 0 to 43 properties. And it was very, very popular. So we know that Kiwis are really aspirational. They're interested in how do you go from not having millionaire parents, starting basically at 0 and pulling yourself up. And I know that one of the very interesting stories you shared in that Stuff piece was about how you got your first start and how a kind of older mentor helped you out.
Yeah, so I'd been working hard. At that stage, I'd got a proper job. I'd gone to work for the BNZ. I was saving diligently. I didn't spend a lot, so I would do things like brew my own alcohol. I would, I'd cook at home. There wasn't much that I had to spend any money on, and as a result, I'd diligently save away my deposit. And then I remember I'd been thinking about investing in property for quite a long time. But I kept kicking the can down the road because I was a bit nervous and I didn't really know where to get started, didn't know if I could get the money. And I got taken out by a guy called Tony Mounts, who's a friend of mine now, who was like the mortgage legend of the South Island for the BNZ. And he was just showing me how his role as a mobile mortgage manager worked. And I remember we were talking about kind of the fact that I was thinking about buying a property, and he said, "How much deposit do you have?" And I think I said $12,000. And he said, "Oh, well, how much is you pay?" And I said $40,000. And he said,
Were you doing $40,000 in 2003?
something like that. I think it might have been 37,000. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was 28,000. How would I know? Like, that's so long ago. I don't know. No, it might have been 28,000 or something like that. And then Mountains, he said, "Oh, just do it then. What's stopping you? Just do it. Go and buy something." And so then I started going and making offers.
Now, I think there's two lessons in there. First of all, if you're a property investor, you don't have to come from a rich family, but you do have to start. And that is the main thing, that you don't buy your 40th investment property before you buy your first. And sometimes investors get so concerned about, okay, but if I buy this property, what is the path to buy my 6th or 7th? Well, you don't know that yet. You've just got to get your first. And just before we go on into Andrew's 3 areas of his life, if you want to read the whole story, you've got to check out Opus Plus. This is a free app that we've released for you guys where you can actually run the numbers on any investment property in New Zealand. It is completely free to sign up. And as an added benefit, if you do this, under the guides and courses section, you can read Andrew's full story in about 4,000 words, way more detailed than we released on Stuff, and see how it all happened, including a couple of cute pictures of Andrew's early life as a child. So go check that out. If you either Google Opus Plus or just go to opuspartners.co.nz, click Opus Plus, you'll be able to create your free account.
Look at that carpet.
That is some 1990s carpet right there. I remember we would have had, no, that's almost, when were you born? That's like maybe early, late 80s, early 90s.
Ventriloquism dummy.
Oh, is this you? Yeah, you're the blonde one.
Yeah. And look, who did you think it was? And look, at least I was, am I sporting some some interesting socks back then as well?
Look, not much has changed, has it?
Yeah.
So let's move on to those 3 eras of your life so we can actually find out, well, how do you go from nothing to 43 properties? So I know we're calling era number 1 your hustle era. So what happened in this first stage of your investing life?
So this is when I was completely starting out, and I didn't have much cash to start out with, i.e. my deposit. I think I had saved that $12,000. And what I needed to do is I needed to grow my wealth, because I had an okay income, like it was a starting out income, but I didn't have many expenses. So therefore my limitation was really around my deposit. And so I needed to turn that money into more money as quickly as possible. So everything that I would do was about adding value. So I'd go out and I'd buy, I remember the first trade I bought was Buccleuch Street. I can't remember the address now, but you probably do. And
27.
Was it 27?
I don't know. I just made that up.
No, I think it was number 5. And I would buy a property and I would do cosmetic renovation. applications, and I do most of it myself because I didn't have the money to pay for someone to do it. So I do it badly, by the way, but I would do it as quickly as possible, and then I would either keep that property and try and extract equity, or more often I would sell that property, because this was before the days of Brightline. So you didn't have tax on the profits that you sell. So if you could sell that property, take out your money, you could go and buy another one. And I just do that as many times as possible to try and grow my wealth as quickly as I could.
And I know that over kind of 4 or 5 years that this happened, from 2003 to 2007, you actually flipped a lot of properties. How many was it all up?
I think there would have been about 25, I think, in those early days. And that certainly ramped up as time went on as well, because the first couple, or the first few, that happens really slowly, because you're still figuring things out, and you're still even things like learning how to sell a property, and how to what price to accept when you're selling a property, and not to hold on to a property too long. That takes a bit of learning. So I think the biggest thing that people kind of get wrong is they think that it should all happen all at once, and they think, oh, well, I want my 40 properties, so therefore I need to buy 4 a year for the next 10 years. Probably not. Probably not at all. Probably you buy one property a year, or maybe 2 properties a year, and then it ramps up as time goes on.
And the other thing that's interesting is that by the end of those 5 years, you'd flipped 25 properties, but how many did you actually still own by the end of those 5 years?
Nowhere near that number, so more like 7.
Yeah, okay. And so a lot of this was building up equity so that you could go and buy more properties, because you didn't have a lot of deposit at the start.
Yeah, correct. And also the bank just wasn't going to, with my income levels, let me keep that number of properties.
But if you could go back in your time machine, cool, we're back in 2005, let's call it. Let's buy as many houses as possible and hold on to them. What mistakes do you think you made in that first era of your investment journey?
I think the mistake I was making back then is I was chasing the cash rather than thinking about my long-term strategy. So if I think back to, okay, well, I knew that I wanted to make money. I didn't want to not have money. So what I was trying to do is get my cash out as quickly as possible. So maybe I wasn't as focused as I probably should have been on, okay, maybe I just need to build my career and my personal income, so that then that will propel me into the next phase of my investing career.
But if you were talking to some youngins today, 19-year-olds in 2025, because you started out investing when you were 19, what advice would you give them now if people are starting out in their hustle era?
I definitely think that accepting that the method that we often talk about on the podcast, i.e. the buy and hold, or the build and hold strategy, or the BRRRR strategy, that's not right for you at that stage. Like I actually met with a young guy just the other day, and he'd just finished reading our book, Wealth Plan. And I said to him, what you need to do now is you need to find a property that you can add value as quickly as possible. And you need to take your deposit, which was actually pretty sizable. It was bigger than my deposit. And you need to repeat the process of buying and flipping and paying your capital, paying your Brightline tax if you fall into that, and just repeat the process.
And I remember you once telling me that when you were starting working at the bank, you realized that, like we were saying before, you don't need to necessarily have a lot of money and all ready to be rich to invest in property, but investing can make you rich. Do you remember that story?
Yeah, I think that was probably quite, it was quite interesting. The branch that I worked at had a lot of business owners, but then also just had quite a wide range of people with different wealth journeys, or in different parts of their wealth journey. And I remember there was this really, really sweet old man that used to come in all the time, and he hardly ever wears shoes. And he'd come bowling into my office, just like with no appointment, right? And he looked like he didn't have any money. And that would have been my assumption. And he actually owned a huge amount of properties around Addington, which is actually an area where we do a lot of work nowadays, with like hardly any debt, right? And I think probably that made me realize, okay, well, you can't judge a book by its cover. That's probably a big thing. But also that I needed to educate myself on, well, this guy who really just kind of had a modest income, he's really rich. He's richer than a lot of people that you'd meet today. So I need to learn what it is that I need to know before I get into investing. And so that's when I started reading things like Rich Dad, Poor Dad, actually started educating myself, which is so much easier nowadays than it was back then, because you go to the library and get a book out and then have to return a few weeks later. Nowadays you've got the internet, you got YouTube, you got podcasts, you got everything.
So your first era, 2003 to 2007, mainly flipping properties, flipped 20 properties, ended up coming out of that era with 7 properties in total. And then we move on to kind of what we call your expanding era, where you did buy a lot of properties very quickly. And this happened over about 9 years, from 2007 to 2018. So what happened over those 9 years?
So at this stage now, I'm a mortgage broker. I'm making better money. I'm quite familiar with property investment. I'm mixing with property investment circles. I thought, right, I'm going to get my parents into investing, convince them to invest with me in some property. And then the GFC hit. And so that first property that they were finally brave enough to ever buy, by the time we bought that, it was down 25 grand. So it was quite a lot of money, given that the purchase price was under $400,000, I think, from memory. So I just talked them into doing something, and they've lost some money. The GFC hit, so it's harder to do my job as a mortgage broker. But I'm just continuing to invest because I understand it's about the long term. But as I'm continuing to invest, I'm doing what a lot of people do, which is just buying properties around them, i.e. in Christchurch, and thinking, oh yeah, this is going well. It's so easy. Cheap property in Christchurch, cheap, not like that scary Auckland that's so expensive. And then the earthquakes hit. And all of a sudden I was in a point of time where, okay, I've got quite a lot of properties, but quite a lot of debt. My income was potentially going to be affected by the fact that the earthquakes meant you couldn't borrow against a house in the short term unless you'd had things signed off, or you couldn't settle a property without insurance, which was hard to get. And now I've got a point where I'm like, this was really dumb. I should never have put all my eggs in one basket. I should know better than that. That's completely stupid. And it could have actually meant the end of me. If I had more properties that were damaged and insurance companies not paying out and tenants leaving, that would have wiped me out.
Because you still would have had to pay your mortgage,
Yeah.
but you would have had no rental income.
Yeah. Like even the top up was bad enough without taking out, a couple of tenancies, or maybe, a 50 grand repair bill because the insurance was not enough for that property or something like that.
And then on top of that, because you were basically a contractor, right? At that point, you weren't earning a salary.
Self-employed.
You're self-employed. So because you were writing mortgages in Christchurch, and then after the earthquakes, you couldn't write mortgages for houses, right? Because the bank wasn't going to lend any money against the property in Christchurch before they figured out whether it was damaged or not, because they want to make sure that property actually has some value, and it was so uncertain after that. So is it fair to say that you almost went broke at that point?
Yeah, 100%. Had the chips not landed the way they did, it could have gone very, very badly for me.
And so what have you done since then to kind of take that lesson on board?
So the number one thing that I've probably done is I've made sure that I have more buffers in place. So that's something that I can control very easily. The other thing I could control very easily is, okay, well, I can't control where a natural event happens, but I can control where my properties are. So I put a lot more focus on investing outside of Christchurch after that day.
And the other thing that's interesting is, out of that horrific tragedy came some opportunities in property.
Yeah, there was a period of my investing where I really ramped up because there was some arbitrage between properties that were on the market that were earthquake damaged, and the fact that people wanted to just get rid of it. They didn't want to have the hassle of that anymore. They wanted to move out of their house and move on with their life. And the fact that, I could actually have this repaired because now I've got a lot of contacts in the building industry. I could repair that property, reinsure that property, and sell it out to a nice other new buyer that is quite happy to buy a property that's been earthquake repaired, but it's a good deal for everyone. And so that was a time when a lot of my properties I would buy, renovate, fix, and sell. and then I would pocket the best ones for myself and just grow a portfolio like that.
And then I know at the same time as you're doing this earthquake damage stuff, flipping some, keeping some, you're also loaning up on new builds.
Yeah. So because my business at that stage was in new builds, i.e. Opus Partners, I was thinking, okay, well, this is actually quite a nice, easy way of investing. I want to keep the best of the properties that I've renovated, and I want to just have properties that are going to be stress-free, because bear in mind now, I've got, 15 years worth of buying older properties and having quite big maintenance bills. So some of my properties were quite maintenance heavy. So I was just buying new builds and parking them aside and making sure I was buying in places like Auckland, where I didn't have to be exposed to the Christchurch market.
So by the time we end this expanding era in 2018, you would have been investing for 15 years. How many did you have at that point?
So I think probably around there, it was probably early 30s, so 32, I think.
Okay. And then, so 15 years to get your 32 properties. What was the last era? What happened there?
So this is kind of me now, which is the long-term era. So now what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, well, property's been really, really good to get me to where I am today, but I had a whole lot of properties that were tax inefficient because of the government's changes to interest deductibility, high maintenance bills, and maybe just a bit more hassle. So some of the stuff in Christchurch that had been repaired, there would be things come up, like, a tenant would call you and say, oh, there's something funny happening here. And I just needed to take away the mental bandwidth that was taking away from me just carrying on doing my job. And now I'm at a stage where, okay, having a family is more important to me. So what I did was start to sell down a lot of those inefficient properties and replace them with new builds that I didn't have to worry about. And so I could carry on growing my portfolio, but the time and the energy becomes more of a focus for me now.
So it's been 7 years in this kind of long-term era, and you're up to 43. So you would have got another 11 properties over the last 7 years, but you've been selling some, buying some. How many do you think you've bought over the last 7 years?
So I would say it's probably around 20. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head without looking at my spreadsheet, but probably 20.
It's quite a lot of properties. So you're talking about like basically 3 a year, a little under 3
that
a
would
year.
sound right.
And what do you think people get wrong about when they move into this era of investing, where you're thinking more about the long term?
So an interesting conversation I had with an investor the other day was I told them to get rid of a property, and they said, oh, I don't want to get rid of that property. You say never to sell a property. I'm like, yes, but that is a rubbish investment now. And you don't want to, they'd lived in the property previously, so they had this emotional attachment. Property investment's just about the numbers. I get that houses we live in and we get emotionally attached to, but you've got to just focus on the numbers. So don't get emotionally attached. If something's a dog of a deal or doesn't make sense anymore, if it's got you to this level and now you're ready for the next stage of your investing, get rid of the stuff that doesn't work and replace it with better properties.
And I know that in this last era, you actually bought a house for the first time. So after buying like 32 investment properties, you finally bought your own home. And I know that had some interesting eye-openers as well.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that because I am such an investor mindset, buying an owner-occupied property, it was really challenging for me because it didn't make economic sense to me. I'm like, I'm tying all this money in an owner-occupied property. I don't want to do that. It feels like a waste of money. And it kind of made me realize, well, for all these years, I've been telling owner-occupiers to get into the investor mindset, and it's hard for them. So it can go both ways.
Yeah, I remember when I bought my first home after buying 5 investment properties, I think it was 4 or 5, and then you start looking at your own home and you get real emotional about it, and you're like, wow, this is so interesting, and probably very normal that you get emotionally invested in your house. And then you think, well, I've got to change my mindset when I move from investing to buying a house. Imagine what it must be like if you're going the other way as well, where you've got to turn off the emotion and then turn on the investment kind of principles. And they are very different ways of buying houses. Now, if you were to summarize it all up and say, what was your biggest learning and your biggest mistake over those, your 21 years investing now, buying, I know you own 43 properties now, but have bought and sold probably over 100 houses yourself. Biggest learning and biggest mistake?
So I think the biggest thing is you want to go hard when you're young and you've got, double income, no kids. I went hard, but I probably could have gone a lot harder if I wanted to. I think the biggest learning was when I almost lost everything by being so exposed in one city. Like, that was just dumb. I should have known better. And if I'd gone broke, that would be my story. Hey, I went broke and I learned from that. So I think that get so caught up in what you know that you just make a stupid decision like that. And I think that if you are young, then you do need to focus on the flips. Or if you're just starting out, you need to focus on the flips. You need to focus on the things to grow your wealth as quickly as possible, so that you can transition into that long term.
And when you say young, what do you mean by young?
Sorry, young, I just mean starting out. Like, if I meet someone that's 40 or 50 and they don't have they've just got enough money for the first deposit, I tell them the same thing. So young, I'm talking about starting out.
And at what point would you kind of recommend that people move from that starting out flipping towards, hey, look, I'm now going to focus more on my own long-term era?
So there's probably two things. Number one is that they've got their own house at that stage. They're relatively settled there and they've got some equity in that. Because the reason I had to flip is because I didn't own my own house. So I couldn't leverage against that. So I had no choice. So if you've got your own house, that's probably a good sign. But also if you've got your own career. So again, while I was working at the bank, I worked long hours, but I had a lot of spare time. And so I had the time to be able to go and do those renovations after work. But I worked till midnight, right? You're not going to do that if you're building a career. So
or if you've got young kids.
Yeah, if you've got a career or kids and you've got your own home with some equity in it, then at that stage you need to start be thinking about the long-term era.
Now, as you've seen, owning properties doesn't mean much if you don't know how to use them properly. And most investors, they waste decades buying the wrong ones, then scramble when it's all too late. So if you want to buy back your time and stop working at 55, watch this next video where I show you the 9-step blueprint to retire early with property.